Imagine waking up one morning, just making your coffee, checking your mail, and you open up this legally binding letter, and it says you're being sued for breaching a contract.
Right. A massive contract.
Exactly, not just some minor dispute. We're talking life-altering, catastrophic penalties.
So you're understandably panicked,
Yeah.
right? You call the number, you get a lawyer, you go to court, and the judge looks at you and asks why you broke the terms of this agreement.
And you just say, Your Honor, I have absolutely no memory of ever signing this. I've never seen this document in my life.
Right. Which, I mean, in any functioning legal system on Earth, that would be the end of the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. The entire concept of a binding contract inherently requires the conscious, informed consent of everyone involved. It's just a foundational premise of justice.
But in this weird thought experiment, the judge just bangs the gavel and says, well, you signed it before you were born. You simply forgot. So you're still completely liable for all the penalties.
It just defies every single concept of logic and basic fairness that we have. It totally does. But the wild part is, when it comes to theology or, the biggest questions of human existence and ultimate accountability, this is exactly the kind of premise that millions of people have just historically accepted without questioning it.
Yeah, and they accept it because, historically, it shifts the burden of proof into this realm of the mystical. It puts the origin of our moral responsibility somewhere out in the unobservable ether.
Rather than in our daily choices.
Exactly. Rather than in the immediate, tangible reality of our structural, everyday decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But the philosopher we are looking at today, Allama Parvez, he looks at this framing and just dismantles it entirely.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking an incredibly dense, fascinating lecture Parvez delivered in July of 1980, focusing on Surah Yaseen, specifically verses 60 through 73.
And we should warn you, if you're expecting a conventional, soothing theological sermon, this is not that.
Not at all.
Parvez translates this ancient text into a rigorously logical socioeconomic framework. I mean, it's basically a modern anthropology of civilization.
Yeah, it's a blueprint of how societies build themselves up, how they decay, and why they ultimately collapse into these brutal totalitarian systems.
So to really understand this model of civilizational collapse, we have to start right there at the foundation with that mysterious contract that humanity supposedly forgot it made.
Right, the hook of the whole passage. So the text opens with this really arresting direct address from the divine to humanity, and it translates roughly to, "Did I not covenant with you, O children of Adam, that you should not worship Shaitan?"
Right.
Now, the traditional interpretation of this verse is tied to this concept known as the Day of Elast, which is exactly that courtroom nightmare I just described.
Yeah, the Day of Elast is this very classical theological concept. It posits that long before the physical universe was ever created, the divine gathered the souls of every single human being who would ever exist.
Like past, present, and future.
All of them. Into this massive mystical assembly. And in this pre-birth state, God supposedly extracted a verbal oath from all these souls, making them promise to worship him and reject Shaitan.
And then, because we're in the physical world now, we've just suffered this collective amnesia about the whole event.
Right. And Parvez approaches this from the perspective of, like, a constitutional lawyer or a logician. He points out that if the ultimate sovereign of the universe is perfectly just, he would never operate a legal system that relies on erased memories.
Right, because you just can't punish an entity for violating terms they have no cognitive access to. It makes no sense.
Exactly. So if this covenant isn't some magical, forgotten oath sworn by disembodied souls, what actually is it? Because the text still explicitly claims a binding agreement exists.
And this is where Parvez introduces this huge paradigm shift. He brings in the concept of deen-e-fitra.
Yes, fitra.
Which broadly translates to the inherent nature or the original constitution of a thing. He argues that this covenant is not a historical event that happened in the past.
No, it's happening right now.
Exactly. The covenant is the structural reality built right into your biology and your cognition in the present tense. It's basically your foundational hardware.
I love that analogy. It is your hardware. So the very fact that we are born as human beings constitutes the agreement. To be human is to possess the inherent cognitive architecture to reason, to observe the physical universe, to synthesize information.
To deduce cause and effect.
Exactly. Parvez refers to this comprehensive intellect as aql. So the covenant isn't something you said, it is something you are. You've been given these tools of rationality. The implicit agreement of just having those tools is that you'll actually use them.
Which honestly reframes the entire concept of prophetic history for me. In this reading, prophets weren't sent to deliver these bizarre alien concepts or to, remind people of some ghostly pre-birth gathering.
No, they were sent as activators.
Activators, exactly. They came to remind humanity to use the cognitive machinery that was already just sitting dormant in their own heads.
They were holding up a mirror to the Din Ifitrat,
Mm.
and the terms of this inherent biological contract are highly, highly specific. It operates on a strict hierarchy.
Right, of human faculties.
Yeah. Parwez argues that the fundamental obligation of a human being is to subordinate their immediate emotional drives, what he calls jazbat, to their higher intellect, their aql.
So it's not that emotions are inherently evil, they just make terrible drivers.
That's a great way to put it. They make terrible drivers. They're vital for survival, obviously, and for the richness of the human experience. But jazbat are inherently reactive. They're short-sighted.
They just want immediate gratification or immediate defense.
Exactly. Whereas aql, the intellect, is capable of long-term projection. It can look at an immediate desire and calculate all the disastrous downstream effects of actually indulging it.
Okay, but I need to push back here for a second.
Sure.
If this rationality is built into our hardware as Dini Fitrat, like if it's our default setting, then humans naturally seeking their own survival and self-interest is also part of our hardware, right?
Yeah.
So isn't Parwez kind of contradicting himself? By saying our nature is entirely rational, but then our default behavior throughout all of human history seems to lean heavily toward irrational greed and conflict.
It's a really critical distinction to make, and it hinges on the difference between mere biological survival and actual human actualization.
Okay, unpack that.
Parwez would argue that our capacity for rationality is our default hardware. But the exercise of that capacity requires active effort. Like gravity naturally pulls water downhill.
Right, path of least resistance.
Exactly. Allowing our jazbat, our immediate selfish desires, to dictate our actions is the cognitive path of least resistance. It takes energy and friction and intentionality to use aql to override that immediate pull.
Ah, okay, so the contradiction dissolves when you realize the covenant isn't a guarantee of good behavior.
Right. It's the provision of the ability to choose the higher path.
That makes total sense, which actually brings us perfectly to the second half of that opening verse, the injunction that humanity should not, quote, worship Shaitan.
Yes. This is where the socioeconomic translation really kicks into high gear.
Because when most people hear the word Shaitan, they immediately picture this supernatural entity, right? Like a fallen angel whispering evil thoughts into people's ears.
And Parwez just strips away that mythological veneer entirely. In his framework, Shaitan's not a noun describing a monster. It is a functional principle.
A functional principle of what?
Of irrationality, of self-deception, and extractive self-interest.
So worshiping Shaitan doesn't mean performing some dark ritual in the woods.
Not at all. Worshipping in this context just means submission and obedience. It means organizing your life or, the entirety of your civilization's economy around a principle that is inherently self-defeating.
Wow. Okay, I want to make this incredibly concrete for the listener.
Yeah, lit too.
In Parwez's framework, let's look at a modern scenario. Say a massive corporation discovers a flaw in their product that they know will eventually harm consumers.
Okay.
But they calculate that issuing a recall will hurt their quarterly profit margins and reduce executive bonuses. So they bury the research.
Right.
That decision is driven purely by short-term selfish emotion, overriding the long-term intellect that knows the societal damage it will cause. So in this reading, that corporate boardroom is actively worshiping Shaitan.
That is a perfect application of his theory. It is the institutionalization of deception. And Parwez is fascinated by how easily entire nations slip into this.
He uses this structural analogy, right, to explain the mechanics of it.
Yeah, he talks about laying the foundation of a massive brick wall. If the very first row of bricks, the foundational premise, is laid even slightly crooked, the error compounds.
Right, every subsequent row leans further and further off center.
And eventually, gravity takes over and the whole thing collapses. The collapse is mathematically inevitable.
If the foundational premise of human nature is misunderstood.
Exactly. If they believe they are governed by a mystical fate, or if they believe raw self-interest is the highest good, then the entire architecture of their civilization is crooked.
The courts become corrupt.
The economic systems become predatory. The educational institutions focus on compliance rather than critical thought. The wall leans until it shatters.
And Parwez makes it abundantly clear that this collapse, this shattering, isn't some abstract event waiting for us in the afterlife. It creates a catastrophic reality right now, which leads into his brilliant reimagining of Jahannam, or hell.
Right. So traditionally, Jahannam is understood as this place of physical fire and torment after biological death. But Parwez yanks this concept violently into the present socioeconomic reality.
He argues that Jahannam is a lived experience right now for societies that operate on this extractive satanic principle.
He focuses specifically on the psychological landscape of the elites who benefit the most from these crooked systems. And this is so fascinating because from the outside, a corrupt billionaire or a dictator looks like they've won the game.
Right. They have the mansions, the private security, the absolute political power.
But Parwez paints a portrait of profound internal agony. He points out that an architecture built on exploitation requires constant, exhausting maintenance.
Because if you've built your wealth by deceiving people, your aquil, your intellect, knows the system is unstable.
Exactly. You know that every single person around you, your lieutenants, your judges, your generals, is operating on the exact same selfish principle that you are. Therefore, loyalty does not exist.
You can't trust anyone because you've designed a system where trust is an actual liability.
It generates a state of hyperparanoia. The source text specifically notes that these figures of immense worldly power are restless. They cannot find peace.
Their minds are constantly racing to anticipate the next betrayal.
Yes, that chronic state of anxiety, isolation, and defensive maneuvering that, Parwez argues, is the fire of Jahannam burning in the present tense.
And to insulate themselves from that fire, they build what the text refers to as an army, but it's an army of false supports.
It's the entire apparatus of corruption. The bribed judges who legitimize the theft, the fake witnesses who provide cover, the sprawling PR teams that spin their crimes into philanthropy.
The militarized police forces that crush dissent.
All of it. These are the artificial pillars holding up that crooked wall.
But Parwez says the structural condition that makes these false supports feel reliable is temporary. Eventually, the systemic rot reaches a critical mass.
It has to.
The text describes this pivotal moment when the disbelievers, the architects of this extractive system, stand completely exposed. The army they relied on just evaporates.
Because an army built on self-interest will instantly abandon you the moment it's no longer in their self-interest to protect you. The patrons disappear, the intermediaries vanish.
The hollow nature of the institutions is just laid bare.
And when those traditional corrupt systems of accountability completely fail, the text introduces a concept that Parwez finds utterly magnificent.
Oh, this is one of my favorite parts.
It says that a person's own hands and feet will testify against them.
It's so compelling. He takes this ancient, almost metaphorical-sounding verse about body parts speaking, and he anchors it directly in modern scientific reality. He brings up forensics.
Forensics, yes.
Mm-hmm.
He zeroes in on the biological phenomenon of fingerprints and footprint tracking. He marvels at the profound, staggering mathematical reality of human variation.
Right. That out of the billions of human beings who have ever walked the earth, the intricate ridges on your thumb are entirely unique to you.
And it's not just a neat biological quirk. Parwez elevates this. He asks, why would the universe engineer such an infinitely varied biological signature on the very instruments, our hands and feet, that we use to interact with the world and commit our actions?
He views it as a structural failsafe, built right into the fabric of reality.
It's the ultimate countermeasure to the system of deception. In a corrupt society, a human mouth can be bribed to lie. A human witness can be terrified into silence. A judge can be bought.
But the oils left on a murder weapon or the impression of a shoe in the mud cannot lie.
It is biologically impossible to bribe a fingerprint.
Wow.
When all the false supports of a society's legal system collapse, the physical universe itself steps in to provide undeniable testimony.
It's an incontrovertible system of accountability where perfect deception just becomes physically impossible. The universe simply does not allow a lie to remain sealed forever.
Parwez sees this as proof that the physical laws of nature are perfectly aligned with the moral laws of justice. The deception is a temporary anomaly. The truth is the structural baseline that always reasserts itself.
I mean, I see the elegance of that argument, I really do. But it brings up a massive, glaring philosophical problem.
A problem of evil.
Yes, the classic problem of evil. If there is this ultimate divine system of justice built into reality, and if God is the all-powerful, why doesn't he just stop the injustice before it happens?
Right.
Like, it's great that a fingerprint catches a murderer after the fact, but why doesn't the all-powerful turn the murderer's hand to stone before the dagger strikes the innocent victim? Why allow the systemic rot to cause so much suffering in the first place?
That is the eternal tension at the heart of any theological or philosophical system.
Yeah.
And Parwez tackles this head-on through his synthesis of the concept of ikhtiar.
Which means free will or delegated agency, right?
Yes. He argues that God intentionally limited his own intervention in the human sphere. He set the physical laws of the universe and the moral laws of cause and effect, but he fundamentally refuses to micromanage human choices.
So he built the arena, but he doesn't play the game for us.
Precisely. And the reason for this non-intervention is tied directly back to the covenant of Enkel, of the intellect.
How so?
Well, if God intervened every time a human being was about to make an irrational or cruel choice, if a lightning bolt struck every corrupt CEO or dictator the moment they signed an extractive law, then human beings wouldn't be moral agents.
We'd just be completely conditioned, terrified animals in a Skinner box.
Exactly. We wouldn't be using our intellect to choose justice. We would just be avoiding immediate physical punishment.
So for the choice of justice to have any actual meaning, the choice of immense cruelty has to be genuinely available and temporarily successful.
The false supports in a corrupt society are allowed to feel reliable for a while, exactly because humans were given enough rope to hang themselves. The universe allows the lie to play out, to build its crooked wall, until the structural logic of reality causes the inevitable collapse.
That delayed consequence is the necessary space where the human self is forged.
Exactly. And this idea of systems playing out their inevitable logic leads perfectly into how Parwez views the life cycle of civilizations.
Right, because he argues that the cycle of actions and consequences isn't just moral philosophy, it mirrors biology. Which brings us to his analysis of the physics of societies and this concept of Arzal-Umfut.
Arzal-Umfut, it translates to the lowest, most declining stage of life, the period of deep old age.
Yeah.
Parwez observes the biological trajectory of an individual. We begin in total helplessness as infants. We build up to peak physical and mental strength in our youth and middle age. And then, inevitably, we face the steep decline of old age.
Physical strength wanes, and crucially, the text notes that memory fades. The elderly begin to forget even the basic things they once knew perfectly well.
It's a universally observable biological tragedy. But Parwez applies this biological imperative to sociology. He says civilizations go through the exact same life cycle.
They have an infancy, a peak of innovation, and a period of societal senility.
And from this observation, he extracts a very bold countercultural mandate. In many traditional societies, particularly in the cultural context Parwez was speaking to in 1980, there's this absolute, almost sacred reverence for the past.
Right, the decisions, the interpretations, and the methodologies of previous generations are treated as unquestionable dogma. The older the idea, the more authority it has.
But Parwez completely upends this. He creates a vital distinction between interpersonal compassion and societal governance.
Okay, unpack that difference.
He argues that on a personal level, the elderly must be treated with immense dignity, patience, and deep respect. They sacrificed their own youth and comfort to care for us when we were in our helpless infancy, so we owe them profound care in their helplessness.
That makes sense.
But, and this is the radical pivot, society must not demand blind intellectual obedience to their outdated paradigms.
So, to put this in a modern context, you don't navigate modern-day Tokyo using a map drawn in 1850 just because you respect the cartographer.
I love that.
The city has fundamentally changed. The old map isn't just slightly unhelpful. If you follow it blindly, it will actively lead you into a brick wall.
That is a phenomenal way to illustrate it. Human knowledge compounds at a staggering rate. Parwez notes in the lecture that a child watching television in 1980 had access to scientific realities that the greatest scholars of antiquity couldn't even fathom.
Wow.
A society that binds its political, economic, and scientific progress to the fading faculties of the Arzal-Yul past paralyzes its own evolution. It's choosing civilizational senility over the compounding intellect of the present.
But wait, if the physical body is decaying and the ideas of the past are decaying, is everything just destined to rot?
Not everything.
Because Parwez introduces this fascinating counter-movement to this decay. He talks about something within the human being that actually solidifies as the body weakens.
Yes, he is talking about the kuti, which is the developed, crystallized human consciousness or ego.
The self.
Exactly. While the physical vessel is subject to the inevitable entropy of old age, the properly developed self operates on a completely different trajectory. And to explain this, he uses this incredibly vivid everyday analogy, the process of churning butter from milk.
I love how he uses these pastoral, tangible examples to explain dense philosophical concepts. Walk us through the mechanics of the milk and butter.
So imagine a jug of fresh milk. The milk represents an undeveloped, unformed human consciousness. It has potential, but it lacks structural integrity. Like, if you pour a glass of water into that jug of milk, what happens?
I mean, they mix instantaneously. The milk is diluted, its composition is fundamentally altered by its environment.
It has no boundaries.
Right, it just absorbs whatever is poured into it.
Precisely. It's easily influenced. But if you take that same milk, ferment it into yogurt, and subject it to the rigorous friction of churning, a transformation occurs.
And the churning represents the friction of life, right?
Yes. The active use of alcohol to make difficult choices, the resistance against despot, the struggle to align with universal laws. Through that sustained effort, you extract the butter.
So the butter was always latent in the milk, but it required friction to actually manifest.
Yeah. And once that butter is fully formed, once it has crystallized, its physical properties are entirely different. You can take a solid block of butter and drop it into a bucket of water, and you can leave it there all day. It will not dissolve.
It maintains its structural integrity.
It is completely immune to the diluting effects of its environment.
So the butter is the fully realized cootie.
It is the crystallized self. As a person moves through the decades, exercising their intellect and resisting that satanic system of extraction, their consciousness hardens like the butter.
So when they reach old age, their bones might ache, their physical vision might fade, but their core identity, their moral clarity, remains razor sharp and impervious to the decay around them. That is a beautiful image, but I have a really practical concern here.
Sure. What is it?
We all know people who get older and their personalities definitely harden, but they don't crystallize into wisdom. They crystallize into extreme bitterness, prejudice, or sheer stubbornness.
Oh, definitely.
So if the self is solidifying over time, how do we ensure it crystallizes around objective truth rather than just a deeply entrenched bias?
That is the crucial caveat in Parwez's framework. The butter only forms correctly into a nourishing, stable substance if the churning process is governed by the correct methodology.
Meaning intellect over emotion.
Exactly. If a person spends their life governed by jazbat, by selfish emotions, irrational fears, and the pursuit of false supports, their ego will certainly harden, but it hardens into a brittle arrogance. To ensure that the individual and the society crystallize around truth, they need a concrete, objective roadmap. They cannot rely on emotional indulgence.
Which actually provides the perfect bridge into Parwez's intense critique of aesthetic indulgence versus revolutionary action. Because in the text, he draws a stark contrast between a concrete manifesto and the mindset of poetry.
Yes. The source text Parwez is analyzing contains a very explicit defense of the divine message. It actively distances itself from being labeled as poetry or shi'ari.
Which to a modern listener might sound a little strange. We generally revere poetry as a high art form. It's beautiful, it's expressive. Why is the text so adamant about not being categorized as a poem?
Because Parwez isn't critiquing the artistic arrangement of rhyming words. He is diagnosing shi'ari as a specific, dangerous psychological condition.
A psychological condition.
In this context, yes. He views the poetic mindset as a state of pure emotional indulgence that completely lacks a concrete destination. A poet, in his critique, revels in the feeling of melancholy, in crying over imaginary lovers or fictional miseries, but never takes a single material step to alleviate real-world suffering.
So it's the prioritization of aesthetics over action.
Yes.
It's prioritizing the vibe of sadness over the hard work of justice.
Exactly. Parwez argues that the Quran and the covenant of Akhl it reminds us of is a revolutionary program. It operates on intellect, verifiable evidence, and actionable socioeconomic goals. It is a proclamation.
And a manifesto is designed to change the material reality of human beings.
Right. While the poetic mindset deals entirely in illusions, it wants to feel without doing.
And Parwez uses the striking, culturally resonant Arabic idiom to illustrate the tragedy of this mindset, right? The camel with the false thirst.
The Judy Piaz.
Yeah.
Imagine a camel wandering endlessly across the harsh desert dunes. It's frantic, its tongue is hanging out, it is desperately searching for an oasis.
It runs from valley to valley, chasing shimmering mirages.
But the profound tragedy of this camel is that its thirst is not a physical deficit of hydration. The thirst is entirely psychological. It's a neurological glitch.
So even if the camel finally finds a real lake and drinks until its stomach is literally bursting, the sensation of thirst will never turn off.
The relief never arrives. It will stand in the middle of a lake and still feel like it is dying of dehydration. It will just keep wandering, perpetually unsatisfied, until it collapses.
When I read this analogy in Parwez's lecture, it felt like someone had reached out of 1980 and perfectly diagnosed the psychological plague of the modern internet era.
Oh, absolutely.
The GDPR is the exact mechanism of doom scrolling and hyperconsumerism. We are the camels in the desert of the attention economy.
That's a terrifyingly accurate way to frame it.
Right. You swipe through short-form videos for 3 hours, desperately looking for a piece of information or a laugh that will finally make you feel satisfied and fulfilled. But the algorithm is explicitly designed so that the thirst is never quenched.
Because if you're quenched, you close the app.
Exactly. The content provides the illusion of connection without any actual material destination.
It is the industrialization of the false thirst. The algorithm induces GDPRs to keep you swiping. And Parwez's warning here is severe. If a society abandons the revolutionary, rational program of fixing the real world and instead wanders into this desert of pure emotional consumption, whether that's classical poetry or modern digital dopamine, the consequences are not just a vague feeling of emptiness.
The consequences are structural, brutal, and profoundly dehumanizing. Which brings us to the climax of this entire socioeconomic model, the anthropology of civilizational failure.
Yes.
We need to talk about what happens when human beings are fundamentally reduced to livestock.
Parwez unpacks the concept of animam, which translates directly to cattle, livestock, or beasts of burden. He looks at the verses that detail the purpose of these animals. They were biologically designed to be subjugated.
The text observes that humans ride them, place heavy yokes on their necks, extract their physical labor in the fields, and ultimately consume their flesh and milk.
Right. An animal like a horse or an ox does not have an independent destination. It doesn't decide to plow a field. The farmer holding the whip decides.
The animal's entire existence is instrumentalized for the benefit of the owner.
And here is the terrifying, radical pivot Parwez makes. He argues that this dynamic of subjugation is not limited to the relationship between humans and animals. He applies it to the structural relationship between different classes of human beings.
He argues that when a human being abdicates their fundamental covenant, when they stop using their aql, their critical intellect, and surrender to their jazbat, their base emotional desires, and live entirely for the purpose of eating, drinking, and seeking entertainment,
They actually change their structural classification within reality.
they drop from the elevated status of human consciousness down to an animal level of existence. And structurally, in the eyes of the societal machinery, they become anam.
They become livestock.
And the horrifying consequence of this isn't just a loss of dignity, it's an open invitation to exploitation, because nature abhors a vacuum, right? If a population cognitively drops to the level of cattle, the powerful, predatory elites of that society will not treat them as autonomous citizens with rights.
No, they will treat them exactly like cattle. This is the pure mechanics of exploitation. Totalitarianism and severe economic oppression do not just fall out of the sky. If a population operates on the level of beasts of burden distracted by false thirsts, unwilling to do the hard work of critical thought, the elites will eagerly climb onto their backs and ride them.
They'll extract their physical labor through stagnant wages. They'll burden them with inescapable cycles of debt.
And, as Parwez puts it quite viscerally, echoing the classical metaphors of extraction, they will metaphorically drink their blood.
It's the mechanics of total elite capture, which brings up the vital concept of ownership in Parwez's framework, the concept of the Malik.
A Malik is an owner. It implies absolute sovereign control and the right of disposal over an object or an animal. You are the Malik of your car. You can drive it, sell it, or scrap it. You are the Malik of your cattle.
But Parwez is uncompromising on this next point.
Very uncompromising.
Structurally and morally, no human being has the right to be the Melek over another human being.
Because a human being has inherent agency. They have their own destination.
Precisely. In his framework, only God is the ultimate sovereign, the Rabu Nas, which means the Lord, sustainer, and nourisher of humanity. The role of a Rab is to facilitate the growth and actualization of the subject.
while the role of an illegitimate human Malik is purely to extract.
Right. When a political dictator, a feudal lord, or a monolithic corporate entity treats people merely as instruments for their own enrichment, they are illegitimately claiming a title that does not belong to them.
They are trying to be gods over cattle.
I want to make sure I'm clarifying the causality here because this is the core of his thesis. Parwes is saying that extreme wealth inequality, political subjugation, and totalitarianism, these things don't just happen to an innocent society out of nowhere. It is a symbiotic relationship of decay.
It is entirely symbiotic.
Yeah.
When individuals within a society abandon the covenant of reason, when they prioritize immediate consumption and emotional indulgence over intellectual rigor, they lower their own defenses.
They become domesticable.
Yes, domesticable. And human history proves that there will always be opportunistic, predatory elites ready to step into the role of the farmer. They're always ready to herd the cattle.
So the covenant of reason, the active daily use of intellect, is literally the only shield against this satanic system of extraction. Once the intellect is surrendered, domestication is inevitable.
And this ties back to a profound image embedded in the source text, which Parwes views as a warning about latent potential, the concept of drawing fire from green trees.
Oh, this part was wild. The text asks, "Who made fire for you from green trees, so that from them you kindle?" How does he interpret that? Fire from a wet, living tree.
He treats it as a statement about the inherent dual nature of reality. The same organic material that grows, provides shade, and bears fruit, contains within it the latent chemical capacity for total destruction.
So the fire was always there, locked inside the cellular structure of the wood.
Exactly, just waiting for the precise conditions of friction and heat to be released.
So it's a metaphor for civilizational potential.
It is. The human intellect, the societal structures, the natural resources we possess, they are the green trees. They have the capacity to build a flourishing, equitable civilization. But the capacity for catastrophic destruction, for Jahannam, is embedded in the exact same material.
Wow.
Misuse of human potential, the surrender of reason, the elevation of self-interest, these are the friction points that ignite the latent fire. The society burns itself down using its own inherent materials.
Humans repeatedly engineer their own subjugation. We build the fire in our own trees.
We really do.
That is a staggering synthesis of the material. Let's bring this all the way back to the beginning to crystallize Parwes's argument. We started by talking about the absurdity of a courtroom and a contract you didn't remember signing.
Right, the day of a last.
And what we've uncovered through Parwes's rationalist lens is that the contract isn't hidden in some pre-birth mystical vault. It isn't a magical oath you forgot.
The contract is the neurological architecture inside your head. It is your inherent capacity to look at the world, to identify exploitation, to trace cause and effect, and to refuse to let your immediate emotions be weaponized against your long-term survival.
The covenant is active. The terms are being tested every single day in every structural decision a society makes.
Yeah, if you use your intellect, your self crystallizes like butter, immune to the decay around you.
And if you abandon it, you become livestock, waiting to be extracted by the elites who are burning in their own worldly hell of paranoia. It is an incredibly stark, mechanically precise warning about the physics of human civilization.
And importantly, it places the responsibility for societal salvation squarely on human shoulders in the present moment, rather than deferring it to mystical intervention.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Parwes's framework, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over as you step back out into the world. Look at the institutions you interact with today. Look at the monolithic corporations where you spend your money and your time.
And look at the algorithms.
Especially the algorithms. Look at the glowing rectangle in your pocket that feeds you a constant stream of information and emotion. Ask yourself, are these systems treating you as a rational, autonomous human being with a unique destination and a purpose? Are they trying to develop your equal?
Or have they categorized you as an imam?
Are you just livestock to them, a predictable data point, a source of attention and labor, wandering the digital desert with a false thirst, simply waiting to be extracted by the owners of the platform? The structures of extraction haven't disappeared since 1980. They have just become vastly more efficient at hurting us.
The question remains, what is your role in reclaiming your intellect today?
Because the courtroom of reality is currently in session, and your own hands and feet are already taking notes. Thank you for listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive.